Are the existence of plant thorns and thistles proof that the world can only be a few thousand years old? Many young Earth creationists say yes, and they've harnessed these botanical features as evidence for their claims that the Earth is young and that a global flood accounts for the majority of fossils, including fossils of plant thorns, spines, and thistles, asserting that these features are relics of a world altered by the consequences of Adam's original sin. So, did Adam and Eve see thorns? Did their actions really cause the origin of thorns? Did thorns exist in the prelapsarian world, the world before sin? Let's look at these thorny questions, including their theological implications, coming up next. Yeah, so what got me thinking about this thorny question? What's the origin of thorns, and how do young Earth creationists think about thorns? Well, I watched this video a number of years back by Creation. It was on the website creationtoday.org. This is a kind of a fringe young Earth creationist site from Australia, and the person pictured here is John Mackay. Now, John Mackay is I'll say a colleague, an old colleague of Ken Ham's back when Ken Ham was in Australia. And John Mackay is still in Australia and still making videos even today. And here he is, and you can see in this screenshot, I'm not going to show you any of the video, this is all we really need, and I'll summarize his main points. You can see in this picture, he has this picture of a rock, and there's a plant fossil there, presumably, that has thorns in it. And you see the description here, this rock formed after Adam sinned. Let me summarize the logical progression, at least logical for John Mackay. All right, it goes a little something like this. Thorns only came into existence after the fall of Adam because after the fall, God curses the ground. And Genesis 3:18 says, it, which refers to the ground, will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. So this is the crucial verse. Therefore, any plants that have thorns must have arisen after the fall of Adam, right? Because he's interpreted this verse as necessarily meaning that only because of God's curse on the ground did thorns and thistles appear. And therefore, thorns and thistles did not exist prior to this time. They weren't part of the original creation, the original 6 days of creation. And then we can continue on from there. And he says, look, if there are fossils of plants that appear to have thorns, therefore, then these fossils and these rocks that contain them, they had to have formed after the fall of Adam as well, right? Any rock that has a fossil must be the result of death of some sort, and therefore is the result of Adam's sin. And this is just taking it to the plant world as well, saying plants that have thorns only could have existed after Adam's fall, and therefore these rocks with these fossils in them had to also have appeared after Adam's fall. And then lastly, we know that Adam's fall occurred around 6,000 years ago, and thus the fossils in the rocks must be younger than 6,000 years. So if you see a rock and you see a fossil in it, and it's of a plant, and it has anything that looks like a thorn, there's your evidence. The world must be young, right? Only 6,000 years old at most, because thorns and thistles themselves can only be 6,000 years old. So in a nutshell, along with the assumption there's no death, at least of animals, before the fall, this is what drives young Earth creationists to claim that all rocks and the fossils that are in them must be young. Right? And then if all those organisms that show evidence of death are in rocks, those rocks have to be young. And how can we explain that? Well, we have to accommodate that by Noah's flood. And therefore, the existence of fossilized thorns as well have to be the result of Noah's flood. So how can young Earth creationists be so dogmatic in their assertion that thorns could not have existed in the original creation? I would assert that scriptures provide no direct support for this interpretation of Genesis 3. Genesis 3 merely says that thorns will be produced for man to make his work more difficult. In other words, Genesis 3 could well be interpreted as describing new functions for thorns and thistles, not necessarily the actual physical creation of the structures themselves. Does assigning function to thorns prove that no thorns existed for other purposes prior to the fall? The assumption that Adam's sin resulted in brand new creation of thorns appears to have arisen from modern man's assumptions of what is good and perfect, or what a good and perfect world should look like. John Mackay and a whole lot of other young earth creationists, such as Ken Ham, they've decided that plants with thorns just couldn't be part of God's good plan. After all, thorns are things that seem like they would hurt somebody, right? They feel like they bring pain into this world. That can't exist in a very good creation. I'm going to contend that thorns are actually an integral part of what would be called a good creation. Mackay essentially argues that any sharp projection on a plant could not have existed prior to the fall because, a sharp end would not be part of a good creation, obviously. Some of this reminds me of some discussions I've had with creationists where they've told me that the original planets all had perfectly circular orbits around the sun before the fall, right? It was Adam's sin that actually caused the decay of their orbits into these oval ones. I mean, part of their justification is that there wouldn't have been any real dramatic climate in the original Earth, right? You can't have, cold places and hot places because one's not better. One must be better than the other. Everything had to be the same all over the whole Earth. And you couldn't have that if you had an oval orbit. But it also, I think, confers this idea that some people have in their minds that somehow a circle is better than an oval, right? It's more perfect. And ovals are imperfect things. And God couldn't be associated with something that's imperfect. An original creation is perfect and therefore circles, right? An original creation, no thorns. Can't have any spiky projections on anything because they would have the potential to cause damage to other things, and that can't be. All right, so now all of this really is just a pretense for me to talk about Adam, the Eden, and the land outside of Eden. Now, I admit, bringing up thorns was a little bit of a pretense for me to really talk about Adam and Eve, Eden and the Garden of Eden, and really what young earth creationists, how they think about what the garden was like versus the entire earth. Because even if we grant that young earth creationists, their conception of the garden as being a very good creation or an excellent or a perfect creation, where there was no sorrow or no pain, no death, is it really necessary to believe that the entire earth was identical to the Garden of Eden? Remember, in Genesis, Eden is depicted as a geographical location, right? A geographical location on earth or in the land, the totality of the land. And it's what? It's set apart from the rest of creation. It's distinct from the rest of his creation. Indeed, the garden itself was found to be in a specific part of Eden. So Eden is a place. And within Eden, there is the Garden of Eden. And that Garden of Eden is placed in the east of Eden. The Garden of Eden is frequently depicted by young earth creationist, or really, let's say, young earth literalist, as being a place of perfection. How then was the garden distinguished from the rest of creation? I find it interesting that the Garden of Eden, which has been portrayed in innumerable numbers of paintings over the years, is almost always depicted as a lush tropical paradise. And I think those paintings and the way young earth creationists also think about perfection lends this idea that lush growth represents perfection versus less growth, all right, where there's less food, right? That's an imperfect state. But even so, what about the world outside the garden? Right? If the Garden of Eden was a lush place, does that mean the entire earth or the entire globe was the same, right? From the Arctic all the way down to the equator. Was this world outside of the Garden of Eden? Or even outside, more importantly, outside of Eden, the land of Eden? Was it less good in the minds of creationists? Was it somehow different, ecologically different? Did it have different plants and different animals? I think these questions they're just rarely addressed in the young earth creationist literature. They always act as if the entire earth was a perfect paradise. The assumption seems to be that the entire earth was a perfect paradise, despite some very clear indications from the rest of Scripture that this is not the relationship of the Garden of Eden with the outside world. The key, and I'm going to summarize a few of the views of G.K. Beale, which is one of my favorite theologians. And these are a couple of his writings here in which he explores the temple imagery and how the church's mission, the overall mission of the church through time, involves the expansion of the temple, all right, the biblical theology of the dwelling place of God. Or the subtitle of the book on the right here, Expanding Eden to the Ends of the Earth. And what G.K. Beale and others who have taken up some of his work, their understanding is that the garden represents this holy place in Eden. Right? And it's a sacred place in creation. Right? What is the creation account? It's the creation account itself is a portrait of the beginning of God's unfolding plan for man and his relationship with the thing that he's created, with this man that he's created. I think it's really important to take note that Adam was created outside the Garden of Eden. How do we know? Genesis 2:8. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east. Right? That's how we know the location of the garden inside of the land of Eden, which itself is an area. And what did he do? He put the man who he had formed. And there he put the man who he had formed. Right, we learn in Genesis 1 that God formed Adam out of the dust of the ground. It doesn't say where, but here we do find out that he wasn't created in the Garden of Eden. He was created outside of the Garden of Eden, possibly even outside of Eden itself. So what's the image here? The image is that of a being that's created outside of God's direct presence. And then he takes this creation and brings it into his presence and places him in the Garden of Eden, just as the priest came into the tabernacle or into the temple, into God's presence. Adam was originally made innocent and could enter into God's presence, right? Adam was made innocent. He doesn't have any sin at this point. He can freely walk into or be brought into God's presence where he walks, right, in the midst of the day with God, communicates and communes with God, right, as if he's in the Holy of Holies of the temple. Right? Now, the priest also was able to enter into the inner sanctum, all right, into the inner Holy of Holies. But he had to wash himself, make all these sacrifices, right? Had to clean himself, make himself pure in order to enter into that presence of God. So that place is the only place where what's called the Shekinah glory, or God's dwelling, was exhibited on earth, right? It's the footstool, right? But you have the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. It's God's footstool. That's where man can come in order to commune with God directly. So, therefore, the place where Adam had his origins was outside the dwelling place of God. The image of this place is that of the wilderness, right? It's a disordered creation. It's a formless and void, the formless and void of Genesis 1:1, right? He's taken from the wilderness, placed into Eden, a sanctuary in God's creation where he could commune directly with God. In Eden, Adam was able to walk and talk with God in the Garden of Eden. In Genesis 1, we see that God, the Creator, took the disorder and the initial condition of the cosmos, Genesis 1:1, and put order to it. In Eden, we see that he took the chaos, the wilderness, and made it fit and habitable for man, made it good for man's life, all right, his ability to do his work. In other words, God made it a good place for man. In each case, his creation of things were proclaimed good, not as some kind of ethical statement about the objects themselves, about the actual objects of creation, but rather what is being expressed in the words good and very good. It's their purposes, right? It's how they relate to man. They're good with respect to the relationships, the ecology of man's situation, right? It's their function for which the inspired author is primarily concerned. So just to reiterate, we see man is created in an area potentially of wilderness and chaos, right? Outside of the land, eventually the land of Eden, or you could say the land of Canaan later on in the Bible. But he's eventually established and placed in a place of order and in communion with God. He was in God's temple, and he had direct access to him. There, what was Adam's job? What was his responsibility? He was to tend and protect the garden, right? Guard and defend the garden. Guard and defend it from what? Well, the outside, right? The places outside of Eden, right? The wilderness, the chaos that could creep in, right? He was to have a dominion. Now, part of that expression of dominion was to name the animals. He's given responsibilities. Why could he take on that particular role? Because he's emulating. He's taking on the role which God had taken on in Genesis 1. He's doing some of the tasks that God had done in Genesis 1 in terms of ordering and structuring and giving purpose to the world. In the act of naming the animals, what is Adam doing? He's assigning names. He's providing them with functions to their parts. He's recognizing the creation that God has made, right? And bringing glory to God through that. Just like God assigns the plants for food, the sun, the moon, the stars for signs, and so forth, Adam is also assigning functions and naming the roles of the different types of organisms that God has created. So God made Adam essentially his vice regent over the earth that he had created. And as long as Adam fulfilled his role, he would be in the garden. And that garden would continue to expand until it filled the whole world, all right, until it filled the whole earth. There are many references to this eschatological goal throughout the Bible. And that's where I direct you to people like G.K. Beale, Meredith Kline, and others who have a very full defense of these biblical principles. For starters, G.K. Beale has authored a paper in the Journal of Evangelical Theological Society. I think it's a very accessible summary of what is this large book, Eden, the Temple, and the Church's Mission of the New Creation. And I'll put a link to that particular article below this video. We know what happened, right? Unfortunately, we know more of the story, all right? That might have been the original tent, right? That's the original vision of the garden. But we know what happened. Adam failed to tend and protect the garden. He allowed Satan into Eden. Some theologians might say that that's actually the first sin, right? That's the first fault of Adam, is not listening to Eve and taking of the fruit, right? Or Eve's listening to Satan and taking of the fruit. It's actually Adam allowing for Satan to enter into the garden. Parenthetically, also, if Satan is present in the world and he's outside the garden, right, and Adam allows him to enter, well, what is that world like outside the garden? It's also a world filled with the serpent, right? Satan's presence. Another reason why the rest of that world needs to be overcome, all right? That's part of that dominion process, having dominion over Satan. So, as I just said, Satan is this malevolent force, and he's already present in the world. But in keeping with the image of creation and the garden throughout the whole Bible, the wilderness outside the garden hadn't yet been transformed by Adam and Eve, right? They were only just created, and they're only just now in the garden. They're in God's presence. And their offspring are going to be God's appointed image bearers. But Adam didn't protect Eve. He didn't protect the garden in his role as a priest. And the devil, in the form of the snake, brought the wilderness into the garden. Being tainted by sin, the garden can no longer be inhabited by Adam. Adam has to leave the garden. He has to be cast out. And what is he cast out into? Well, he's cast out into the rest of the world, the place outside the garden, the land outside. Throughout scriptures, being cast outside of the garden, or the promised land later, or outside the holy place of the temple, or the tabernacle, it's always seen as being cast out into a wasteland. That's the description. Being cast out from a place of plenty, a place of perfect communion with God, to a place where the world is against you, to the point where thorns and thistles and sin, affecting people and their relationships, hold us back from fulfilling our true purpose. Can Adam get back into the garden? Can we, as his descendants, get back into the garden? Well, this is where we'd say without a redeemer, getting back to that particular original situation is impossible, right? Hence the necessity of Christ, right? And his coming later in history. Now, we might stop and ask ourselves at this point, why is it that the consistent message of scriptures points to the imagery of places outside of God's presence as being inhospitable, or at least not as hospitable, all right, physically or spiritually? And yet so many people conceptualize the land outside of Eden as this tropical paradise, as if the whole world were this perfect paradise in the original creation. It isn't even clear that Eden was a tropical paradise, as you might imagine today. Right? Rather, a more natural and consistent reading of Genesis that takes into the account of the imagery of Eden in Scripture says Eden is a place set apart from the rest of the world. When Adam sinned, he was cast out in the wilderness where God's bounty, his food and water provisions, and his personal relationship, the most important part, are broken. All right? Adam would now have to contend from a weakened position within a world he was supposed to have transformed. Rather than transforming the world outside by extending the boundaries of the garden, right? By tending and guarding the garden, having offspring, and then transforming, gradually basically pushing the walls of the garden out, or pushing Eden out. He was supposed to envelop the whole earth, right? Bringing the whole earth underneath the realm of the dominion of man, who's God's vice regent on earth. Now, rather than transforming the world, as I just said, the world transforms him. How many times do you hear the warning to the Israelites that if they didn't obey, they would be taken away, right? That other armies would come in, they would be removed from their lands, and what would happen to the land? Thorn bushes would come up and swallow the land. That's always the imagery. Thorn bushes, right? The weeds would come up and devour their fields. This is exactly what happened. The Israelites were carried off, and their previously tended gardens and fields were likened to the Garden of Eden, described as if like the Garden of Eden. They're consumed by thorn bushes, encroaching from the surrounding deserts, right? There is a wasteland, there is a wilderness around all the lands that were cultivated by the Israelites. And you can see the promised land is a poor man's paradise, right? It's the best thing we could have on earth. God promises this land, and he promises that as long as they obey, he'll bring enough water, right? Right? And as long as people have obey God and obey his commandments, aren't stealing from one another, aren't killing one another, don't have pride, don't have envy, all these different things that they shouldn't be doing. And they work together. What are they going to do? They're going to be able to cultivate the land. They're going to be able to bring the bounty of the land in. They're going to be able to prosper. And as they do that, and as they have cultivated lands, those lands are not going to have thorns and thistles in them. Right? But you disobey, you get taken from the land. God also shuts the water off. There's multiple times in scriptures where one of the curses basically is the removal of the rain, which is the lifeblood, right, of that promised land. So let's get back to the application of the origin of thorns, because that's what I started out by saying. What's the origin of thorns? So despite the fall, Adam and his offspring are still under the commission to expand God's kingdom. Right? There's nothing that says that, hey, the original plan for you to expand the garden, all right, this place in which you have perfect community with one another and with God. And as you do so, you'll have the right kind of relationship with the creation as well, right? Bringing it under cultivation and care, not consumption, but care. Right? As you do that, that would expand across the earth, right? As individuals populated and fill the world, right? You would fill the world from that point and cover the world. Now, despite the fall, as I just said, Adam and his offspring, they're still under the commission to expand God's kingdom. We're still under that particular commission. That commission hasn't been drawn away. However, it's like our efforts to do so are greatly hampered, right? They're not nearly as productive as they would have been had we persisted in not sinning, right? If we had not disobeyed God. Because now that we've disobeyed God, it makes it much harder. It makes it much harder to work together, It makes us much harder to be productive. We don't get along, we fight. Right? So, for our interest here, though, we're talking about thorns and thistles. I think this explanation should suffice. In summary, thorns and thistles weren't created de novo in a world lacking them. God created this whole world. No plants had thorns or thistles. They were all nice and soft and juicy, and Adam and Eve could have walked anywhere on the face of the earth and picked up any plant and munched on them because there wouldn't be any toxic chemicals. There would be nothing no spiny points that would hurt them at all. And that's true for all other animals as well. They would have been free to eat everything. No, I don't think so. Right? There's no reason to believe that the world, at least the world outside the garden, right, outside the inner sanctum, right, which really you can think of as the garden as a cultivated place. And in a cultivated place, you don't have the types of plants that are going to be wilderness plants, the types of plants that need their thorns and thistles to survive. But outside of that garden, in the wilderness, those types of features are good features for those plants in order for God to enable them to persist over time. So instead, they are a natural part of creation. They are figuratively and literally now, today, thwarting Adam's and our mission to bring the rest of the world into submission. Rather than successfully transforming the wilderness into a productive garden, the wilderness is encroaching upon humanity. Being removed from the garden meant that Adam would be thrown into a world where thorns and thistles already existed in the wilderness because they served what? A good purpose for those plants. And they now have to compete with humans for those resources. If Adam had continued to cultivate the garden faithfully, he would have had a well-watered land free of thorn bushes. Figuratively, the thorns represent the effects of evil in man's midst. Now that Adam is in the wilderness, both literally and figuratively, he'll have to contend with the pain and the suffering that a lack of a proper relationship with God brings. Emotional and physical distress abound in the world around us. You could say that the creation groans as a result of our inability to cultivate properly this world. But regarding the physical origin of the thorns themselves, the typical young earth proposal that anything resembling a thorn could not have been present in the original creation forces creationists into some rather awkward explanations. McKay talks about all thorns, spines, prickles, and even any other points on plants as degraded parts of an original creation. In his mind, thorns and stems, they've lost their original perfect and good nature. They're just stems. Like stems have converted themselves into gnarly thorns. However, as I'm going to point out for acacias in my next video, where we'll look at the prelapsarian acacia and the good creation to follow up on this theme, thorns might be considered bad for us because they prevent us from easily accessing the fruit on a bush. But they provide homes for ants and are amazing examples of natural design that benefits the organisms involved, similar to how the human eye is for us. So the young earth creationist is faced with a dilemma. They have to denigrate amazing features in this world as the result of sin. So here's this incredible feature, this incredibly designed feature of a thorn. And yet it's just the product of degradation of something that was perfect. So they simultaneously have to claim that these features are examples of intelligent design, but at the same time, they're the results of sin. McKay wants us to believe that all these bad features are the result of negative evolution or de-evolution in his words. He makes it sound like the complex genetic systems, the systems that make these different parts of plants can just easily change the mutations, causing stems to turn into thorns or brand new characteristics. Now, to this argument, I offer up the simple thorn bug. Now, the thorn bug, there's many different species of thorn bugs or plant hoppers. And what they have is they have this modified outer wing casing that mimics different species of plant thorns. Right? There's some that are brown, some that are green, and so forth, and they mimic the types of plants that they're going to attach themselves to. The function's really pretty obvious. When they sit on the stem, they blend in with the stem's thorns, and they're not going to be bothered by birds preying on them. These plants often have thorns themselves, and those thorns, they are mimicking those particular thorns, and therefore providing themselves protection through that mimicry. If there were no thorns, right? So here's my logic. If there were no thorns in the pre-fall world, what we call the prelapsarian state in theological terminology, for what purpose did hundreds of species of thorn bugs make thorns? They have pointy casings where if they sat on bushes in great numbers, they'd be very pesky for one of us to grab, right, off that branch. Could such pain and inconvenience be part of this perfect world? McKay believes that anything that has this point on it, that points are imperfect, right? Because points can cause damage. Right? I'm walking around. I want to crunch. I need some food, and God's given me everything to be food in the original creation, the perfect creation, and therefore I can just pick up anything and just chomp on it. But I got these thorn bugs with these hard cases on them. That's not perfect. That's not very good. Before answering, consider the function of thorns in these bugs. They act as a disguise. It's a form of cryptic variation that allows them to be noticed by one of their chief, or not be noticed by one of their chief predators, birds. But again, let's go back to what was the perfect world. The perfect world didn't need to have such elaborate defenses, right? What good would being cryptic be if plants didn't produce thorns? Birds would have to learn, they would learn really quickly that everything looks like a thorn is not a thorn, since real thorns didn't really exist, and therefore they're bugs and good to eat. The young earth creationist perfect parasite presents an ecological conundrum for young earth creationists who insist there's no death of animals. Now, this does get a little bit tricky because most young earth believers have a naive view of the original creation, to be sure, but young earth leaders such as Ken Ham are a little bit nuanced, a little bit more nuanced. They generally believe that bugs are not living things, as life is defined in the Bible. So insects could and did die before Adam sinned. I know that might sound a little bit strange to you, but most young earth creationists, who I'll call them the academics of the young earth creationist world, thinking through these types of things, have come to the conclusion that organisms like insects are not living. Now, there's disputes about insects, but certainly simpler animals and plants aren't living things. That's why you can eat plants, all right? Because they can't die. Even so, if insects could die, but birds could not in the perfect creation, then one would expect that insects might have defenses against being eaten if God had given birds and animals all non-living things to be eaten. But the thorn bug does raise the same problem. If plant thorns didn't exist, then the thorn bug is not imitating anything at all, and thus a portion of its design defense is useless until Adam sinned, right? And then the plants somehow evolved thorns. God curses the land. Somehow the plants now have thorns on them. So the Garden of Eden, if you consider it an entire world ecosystem, in the young earth creationist mind, must have been a really different place than we can possibly imagine. For example, why would camels have humps if the world was well watered? There was plenty of water and you wouldn't need to store water. Why would antelopes be able to run incredibly fast if there was nothing there to chase after them? The list would go on and on and on of features that we clearly associate with functions that are tied to survival, but have no purpose in a perfect world, right? With no death. And interestingly, Adam gives a lot of names to the animals, and the Hebrew names to many animals incorporate features of these organisms that suggest their survival abilities, suggest the very same kinds of behaviors that they have today. Not of some sort of placid, perfect environment where every organism, where all the features of the organisms have no functional role with respect to protection or for procuring food. Based on other examples from young earth creationist literature, I expect that some young earth creationists will respond that these bugs didn't look like thorns before the fall. Rather, the thorns on their backs were genetically preloaded or designed into their DNA by God, who foreknew that the fall was going to happen and take place. And this is his providential way of providing these bugs with some protection in that new fallen world. Now, what gets me about this argument is that McKay tries so hard to say that no new features can ever evolve, right? That's a big mantra of young earth creationists. You can't evolve new features. And yet so many complex characteristics suddenly appear and have new functions, apparently right after Adam sins. It's not like they're a good branch that becomes a sickly thorn, but rather these thorns are complex adaptations, right, with complex developmental pathways that lead to them changing the structure of a stem and making it into a thorn. Wow. All right. I've said quite a few things, and there are hundreds of angles to run with here. All right. We could go on lots of different tangents, and I think we could pursue some of these ideas a lot farther. But we're not going to do so right now. I've got a second video I'm going to make. Again, I'm going to talk about acacias, and we'll kind of pursue this thorn idea a little bit further. I've said some things that maybe are new to you with respect to things I've said in the past. And so I hope that I've given you something to think about. And I definitely want to explore this idea of perfect creation and what that means to young earth creationists, and whether that truly is a biblical idea or not. That's essentially what I'm challenging here, is the idea that somehow that the whole world has to be this image that young earth creationists have of what perfection means, or what very good is. That thorns can be good, but in a relationship with man in which they are obstructing man's ability to gather food, because God is punishing man for their sin, they become bad, right? They become less than very good for man, right? They obstruct man's ability. But that doesn't mean that those thorns aren't very good in the sense of why God originally created them. All right. Yes, I'm sorry. If I start talking again, I'm just going to keep on going. So let me save some of that for a future video. All right. Hey, subscribe, like, all that good stuff, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.